Hello, we're going to look at some poetry today by Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet is one of the very first American poets, and she's here in the very infancy of this country, and in fact was an immigrant from England. So she is one of the very first women poets that we have writing in this country, and one of our first poets of any sort, of course, doing some writing here. So she's doubly important in that respect. We're going to look at one of her most important and most well-known poems called The Author to Her Book. And we're going to go over this a little bit at a time, but I want to give you just a couple of items about the overall scope of the poem. First, it is written in iambic pentameter. So this tells us what meter the poem is written in. Essentially, that means it's 10 syllables. And the stress pattern is unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed through the length of each line. So each line generally is written that way, although you may find an occasional line that doesn't seem to fit it exactly. But overall, it is written in iambic pentameter. And it's also written in rhyming couplets. So each pair of lines will rhyme, as you see at the ends as you go through the poem. This poem has a very interesting and a very well done metaphor, what we might call an extended metaphor or even a controlling metaphor for the whole poem. Notice the title, and the title is very important here, called The Author to Her Book. When I've sometimes asked students to explicate this poem, what I find in a few of the papers that come back typically is that some folks read this in a very literal sense and want to make the context of the poem point toward a physical, real child. But Anne Bradstreet is not talking about a literal child. This is part of the metaphor that she's using in the poem. A metaphor, of course, is something that's made to be or compared to something else. So we say perhaps that my glasses are a telescope to the world or something like that. It's not literally a telescope, but I'm making that comparison. We might say that a hungry person eats like a lion, and that we make that kind of comparison then, and that's called a metaphor. Well, the metaphor, a controlling metaphor that Anne Bradstreet is using in this poem is comparing her book to a child. And this is the controlling metaphor that runs all the way through the poem. And we're going to take it just a few lines at a time here and kind of go through it slowly so you get a good sense of what the poem is talking about. But keep that in mind. And if you were to read this without the title, and again, the title is The Author to Her Book. If you were to read it without the title, it would be pretty easy to get this confused and not realize that she's talking about her book and not a literal child. First couple of lines here. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain. Well, what's an offspring? Generally, we mean a child like that. But notice here at the end of the first line, it's the offspring of her feeble brain, not of her body, as a physical child would be, but this is an offspring of her brain, something that's come from her mind, her thoughts, her ideas, and she's writing down the lines of poetry. So this is the kind of offspring we're talking about here, a metaphorical offspring. Second line, who after birth didst by my side remain. So, in other words, she's kept the child by her, the metaphorical child, the poetry. And of course, she did not send her poetry out. She did not intend for it to be published. It was sent out by someone else, really unbeknownst to her at all. So this is, again, what she's referring to here. She was keeping these poems to herself. Till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true. And this is the reference to her poems being taken without her knowledge and sent in for publication. Fourth line, who thee abroad exposed to public view, referring now to the publication of her poems without her knowledge or consent. And it wasn't that her friends were trying to do anything evil. They recognized that she was a good poet, and they wanted her poems to be published, and she was perhaps reluctant. We don't have all the details about this, but in any case, she wasn't trying to get them published, and her friends then took care of this for her. Let's go to the fifth line. Made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge. The press we're talking about here is a printing press. But again, notice how we're continuing this extended metaphor, this controlling metaphoric idea here of talking about her poems as if they're children. So the poems trudge, the word trudge talking about walking or getting someplace by a sort of a hard pace, not a leisurely walk, but trudging there, being something of an effort to get there. Made thee in rags, the first part of this line, again, can refer to the rags that someone wears, but also it has a very interesting connotation here in that at the time that this was written, paper, the paper of our books, was made out of rag content, cotton content for the most part, literally made from old scrap cloths in many cases. So what they're talking about here in a way is an excellent metaphor. Not only can it mean the clothes that a child wears, but it literally refers to the rag content paper that her poems are printed on. So she does a really good job of putting this together all through the poem. Where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return, my blushing was not small. Well, there were some errors in her work, and of course some of the errors may be attributable to her, but remember that we're way back in time here relative to what we know about all of this sort of thing today in the printing industry. At the time, print was set one little letter, piece of type at a time, and it had to be set backwards. And believe it or not, sometimes the people setting the press, setting the type, couldn't even read. So it's really easy for somebody to make an error, and you get that old expression, mind your P's and Q's, from this, because it was really easy setting type to misplace a P for a Q in there when you're setting the type backwards, one letter at a time. So this is what she's referring to also. As it went to press, apparently in the printing itself, the setting of the type, there were also some errors that weren't even her errors. But of course, a reader has no way to know if it's her error or a printer's error. So she was, as she says in that next line, at thy return, my blushing was not small. She's a little embarrassed about all of this, the way it turned out perhaps, but mostly because this was just not planned. This was not something that she really wanted to happen. It just happened without her knowledge. My rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Well, this is her first reaction when she gets this knowledge of her poems being printed. She just kind of tosses the book aside as something that she really wasn't quite ready to embrace. But again, she continues this metaphor of a child and comes later to see it in a different light, and they are, after all, her poems. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. So she's decided now she's going to go back to these poems, she's going to revise them some, make them better if she can, correct those blemishes that appear in her poetry, in other words. But again, always going back to this metaphor of it being a child. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. So again, going back to the idea of washing the face of a child, but here she's correcting her errors as she sees them in her poetry, erasing something, putting in the correction and that sort of thing in the actual print. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet. Again, people have joints, people have feet, so it works really well talking about a physical person, but also think of this as metrical feet. Again, we've talked about the metrics of the poem being written in iambic pentameter. She had to work with the meter. The meter doesn't come just without effort. It has to be worked at just like anything else. So she had to go back and work on the metrics, the metrical feet of the poem as well. Yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. So she wants her poems to look better, but she doesn't quite know how to do it and feels really that her own ability is not up to doing it any better. And this is probably what she's referring to here, that the homespun cloth, the way that she's able to present her poems, she's doing the best she can, but she really doesn't feel like her ability is up to what she would like. In this array, mongst vulgars mayest thou roam. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. She knows that her poems are going to come under some scrutiny from critics. This has always been the case with anyone who tries to write anything. But it's even more important for her in her time, because we need to remember, this is hundreds of years ago, writing poetry at this time was considered to be the profession of a man, not of a woman. So she's up against a handicap at this point simply because she's a woman trying to write poetry in a man's world. She knows she's going to be criticized just because of that. Even if her poems are good, they're still going to come under some criticism because she's a woman trying to write seriously at this time. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father ask, say thou hast none. Well, she was married, so obviously she's not referring to a literal child here. But her poems, what she's pointing out, are her work. There's not a man involved in the writing of these poems. These are hers, so they're coming from her alone and her alone. There's no man helping her to write these. So she is, quite literally, the mother and only parent of these poems. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. In other words, if she had not been so poor, and by poor here she probably means poor in ability, if she had been a poet in her own eyes of greater ability, then these poems would have looked better when they were sent out to be printed, and of course they would look better in the book, and all of this would be better poetry in her view. But much of this is genuine humility on her part, partly because she understands that she's a woman writing in a man's age of writing. And she just has this very deep sense of inadequacy to overcome here, even though she is indeed an excellent poet.